Where's Selena? She studies all this stuff.
Welcome to episode 15 to the Humanist Agenda podcast. My name is Kenny.
And I'm Sherry.
So that's it. We have a really small group today. And we want to kind of reflect back on the lecture from last week about essentially right brain, left brain. And Dr. Susan Jones had a talk with our members on the concept of split brain. I thought it was interesting. I've heard of this concept before where there's a thought that people potentially have two consciousness in their brains. And the beginning of the lecture is more of an introduction in how the brain, or I guess the history of seizures. And there was an example of the famous Canadian doctor who was able to
map the brain
and stop seizures by identifying where were the sources of seizures. And near the end of the lecture was interesting because for some patients where they had their hemispheres of their brains separated, an interesting outcome resulted from that separation where one half of the brain would make a decision and the other half of the brain would make a alternative decision as well. And some of these patients who had recently had their hemispheres separated had difficulty with everyday life because one hand would be trying to do one thing and the other hand would be trying to do another thing, and they couldn't come to a consensus. And sometimes it took people a long time to get dressed, for example, and sometimes maybe one side of their brains saw something versus another side of the brain that saw something completely different. So it was really interesting, and I kind of looked up a little bit more with some other videos as well on YouTube, and it's really interesting to see patients trying to either identify things, but then if one side of the brain couldn't quite identify what was on the other side, they would try to rationalize why they didn't see that. And it was just interesting that our brains function that way, and it brings up the question about whether we actually have two consciousness in our brains.
I found the example that she gave about the shopping, the woman who went shopping for groceries, and the one hand would reach for something and the other hand would smack it away. And then it took her 2 hours to do grocery shopping that would normally take her, half the time at least. I found that really interesting, that your body can kind of act in a way that is instinctual almost without you even thinking about it.
So one of the thoughts I had over the week as well was, what if, one part of your brain is a conservative and the other part's liberal?
Oh no.
Or even, the other example that was brought up during the lecture as well was, what if one part of your brain was an atheist and the other part was a theist? Which one goes to heaven?
Only half your body goes to heaven, so then you're walking around with one leg and one arm and hoping for the best.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and as I was kind of looking online just for some additional reading materials, I know there was a study that came out that contradicted this kind of split brain theory, and I'll post it in the notes as well. But I think it's also, it appears to be, at least from my own research, that there's a little bit of unknown here on whether that's truly the case, whether it's truly, two consciousness in one brain, and perhaps it really is just one consciousness, but the splitting of the hemispheres kind of prevent that communication between both sides, which potentially demonstrates some of the symptoms that appears like there's two consciousness, but maybe in reality there really isn't these two consciousness that are living inside your brain.
It's interesting because some of the stuff that I read about is that so your brain has specialization areas. So one area might be good at math, but then there's other parts of the brain that communicate together to help you to solve math problems. So let's say you're good at math, but and you're good at calculations, but then you need to use your problem solving and critical skills in order to solve a problem. So you're kind of communicating with different parts of the brain still.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the extent of what I know about the brain.
That's all I know too. Yeah, good podcast. We're done.
That's the end of the podcast. Bye, everyone. but so I think it's clear to say, we're both not neuroscientists, and we are definitely out of our element when it comes to talking about the brain. But for me, it's interesting to kind of think about, okay, there are some studies that maybe says, we might not have two consciousness in our brains. But as I'm trying to think about, what are the implications if it's shown that, we potentially have two independent consciousness in our brains, like what would be the implications in day-to-day life? So for example, would people that do bad, for example, would we blame it on one half of someone's consciousness, and the other half that has morals is kind of kept silent?
So it's like the angel and the devil on the
Yeah.
shoulder. One of them just gets deleted, and then you've only got the other one.
Yeah.
Or what about the flip side is you've got somebody who only does good to the point of self-sacrificing. They don't have the devil. They don't have that, selfish motivations.
Mhm. I don't know. I was just kind of thinking about it. It's maybe it's really not true that we really have kind of two consciousness.
What
but,
do you think? What's your opinion? Do you think that we have two consciousnesses?
The more I think about it, I feel like we probably don't. I think this brings up the question of maybe what is consciousness, and that's probably even a longer discussion. And I don't have all the scientific backing to maybe have a very coherent opinion on what is consciousness, but
Is that more of a philosophical question though than a scientific one, or can you bring science into that?
I can see where science comes in, because when you think about, let's say, a single cell, I wouldn't view a single cell as having a conscience. But then at what point would you say a organism has consciousness? So a collection of cells, maybe it has a nervous system that can react to external stimuli. Does that mean it has some level of consciousness? I can see an argument where very simple animals maybe have very simple rudimentary kinds of consciousness, and as life gets more complex, their consciousness is more complex, where they can perceive the world, they can understand what's going on, and they can react to it. So for me, consciousness is just kind of a byproduct of evolution. We need this consciousness to survive. And maybe there's some people that think, consciousness is some like special thing out there, but I don't know. For me, consciousness is just a survival tool that organisms have just developed over time in order for us to understand the world around us and to continue to live. We use our consciousness to find food, to reproduce, to avoid danger. I mean, we use consciousness to help us survive. So it's kind of to me, it's just more of a byproduct of life, or specifically our evolution, because we're much more complex than a single cell life. And we need this in order for us to survive.
I would agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about, why we specifically developed consciousness versus, something else that didn't.
But maybe, I can see other organisms have some level of consciousness. I mean, we humans, we have speech. We have the ability to not only produce sounds through our vocal cords, but we can also develop language via our brains and things like that. So I don't know whether I would classify as humans as being like the pinnacle of complexity, but I feel like we've been able to, just through our evolution, been able to develop specific skills that have helped our species survive. And I feel like language and how we interpret the world, these are all just byproducts of our evolution. So I know other people might think, I don't know, humans are like super special, but I feel like I feel like I'm just being realistic that we're not really that special. We kind of developed all this because it's just part of our own evolution, and we needed this to survive as a as a group. We're in I don't know if it's colonies is the right word, but you know, when we're living communities, we needed language in order to facilitate conversations and to be able to coordinate in order to survive the various environmental or predators back, you know, 1,000 years ago. To protect ourselves from various dangers, we needed to develop these skills of language and dexterity in our hands, and to be able to hear danger, things like that.
Do you know, is it something that's special about humans that we develop the complexity of consciousness that we have? Like, why don't dogs have a higher consciousness, or could they reach our consciousness at some point in the future? Or maybe they have such a short lifespan that they would never really get to that point.
Maybe in the very long future, if the right environmental pressures were there that would require dogs to somehow develop language or things like that. But I mean, to me, at the end of the day, it just so happens that our evolution and various either environmental or other external pressures that have allowed humans to form these specific skills in order to understand the world around us. So I don't know. For me, it's I'm not trying to be a negative Nelly, but it's just one of those. I feel like we're not that special. It just so happens we develop these skills because we needed it to survive. I feel like if there weren't certain environmental pressures or pressures for humans to be able to vocally communicate and develop tools, if there weren't these pressures, we probably wouldn't develop the ability to speak and to form tools and to kind of essentially develop technology and things like that in order for us to really get to where we are, essentially. So
I think we are special in a way, though. I don't know. I think that because we are able to adapt so well, I think that's kind of what differentiates us to other species. So our brain is able to change to adapt to its situation. So even when you split the brain, you're able to adapt to it over time versus other species. So other species are sometimes in the same situation we might have been, you know, when we were cavemen. We were running away from predators, we were trying to kill things, etc. There's tons of animals out there that are in that situation, but they haven't developed that same level of consciousness, whereas we as humans have been so adaptable that we've been able to advance as a species.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I'm sure other animals, if we were able to still split their brains, I mean, they would still potentially form the right neural connections to essentially put the pieces back together. I mean, the study I was referring to, where the scientists believe that we don't really have this like split brain within our heads, is because over time people tend to essentially grow out of this like split brain personality where one hand is doing one thing and the other hand's doing another thing, because their hypothesis is the brains are reforming connections after it's split. But
okay, so you don't always end up that way. Like, so if a doctor came in and split your brain, you would eventually develop new neural pathways so that you could
that's what is being postulated in the research, because they essentially try to duplicate the test. So there's a test where, you know, they'll show an image on one side of your face versus the other side of the face to see whether your right eye could see a picture and the left hand attempt to reach out to grab an object that the right side saw. And over time, when they re-examine these people after maybe a few years, it appeared like they didn't really have this split brain personality anymore. It functioned as one. So the hypothesis is there were new connections that are being formed. But in terms of, you know, whether humans are special compared to like other animals, I mean, like dogs, for example, I don't think there's enough at least dogs did not have the same environmental pressures and time that it took to develop anything above and beyond what they currently are. And it just so happened that we humans, luckily, our ancestors had the right amount of environmental pressures to allow us to utilize our skills and develop our skills in order to survive in the environment, and to develop all these things that we come to know in terms of intelligence, language. That's why I feel like, I mean, if let's say humans got were extinct, and then the same environmental pressures were applied onto like a squid, for example, maybe in like a billion years you'll have like super smart squid that are roaming around the planet. So I bring up the squid example because I'll go on a slight tangent, but there's this new Netflix show called Love, Death, and Robots. I don't know if you heard about it.
I haven't watched it yet.
Okay, so it's basically an anthology. It's like Black Mirror, but all animation. They have like 18 episodes. They're all different styles of animation. One of the animations, or one of the stories, is called Alternative Histories, and it basically goes through a scenario where the user can pick a scenario in history and change one variable and see what happens over time. And they kind of frame it up as, this is a demo, so we're going to pick one important part of history, which is the death of Hitler, and then they kind of like branch out into different scenarios of what happens if Hitler died this way, and then kind of show different potential scenarios. One of the scenarios is basically like a super ridiculous scenario where humans all die out and peaceful squid kind of took over the world and eventually became super intelligent and landed on the moon like 2 billion years later. So to me, it kind of illustrates, I mean, depending on time and environmental pressures, technically other forms of consciousness or intelligence, I think, could potentially develop. So that's why I feel like it's not unique to humans. It's just a matter of what type of pressures and what type of timelines a species has to kind of develop over time, and whether it gets wiped out before it even gets a chance to evolve.
So you're saying that in an alternate dimension, there is a super squid race that is running the planet?
Highly possible. But actually, like, octopus are really smart. I don't know if you've seen it.
No idea how smart they
are. I don't know. This is another tangent, but
how many YouTube videos have you been watching today?
But no, it's just like octopus are really, really smart. I mean, they are like one of the world's greatest escape artists. Like, I think a lot of like aquariums around the world, if they were to keep an octopus in a tank, they have to like bolt down every lid and every opening, because the squid is just one of the greatest escape artists, because it can squeeze through the tiniest hole, and it's super smart to figure out how to like poke at things to try to escape.
I have seen them try and like squeeze off of like holes in boats and stuff like that, and it's amazing. There's nothing like there's nothing to them. They're just almost like cartilage, where they can just kind of squish themselves down and out they go. Do they have like super intelligence where they know to poke at things? Or
actually, I wonder, do they even have brains?
I don't know.
Let me look at octopus brain.
I wasn't sure that they did have brains. Well, squids, I didn't know if they had brains. Maybe it's teeny tiny. They have to, right? They've got a nervous system?
Okay, so unverified, this is just a quick Google search, but the first result says an octopus has 3 hearts and 9 brains.
9 brains! So this alternate universe of more superpowered squids and octopuses is true. It happened. It's in an alternate reality. We'll get there. You
can't beat 9 brains. But yeah, I would suspect it's mostly just like a very large nervous system.
I'm shocked they have a huge nervous system. What do they need it for?
Well, I mean, it's in their tentacles, right? There's gotta be nerve endings.
But we have lots of nerve endings, and we don't have like a million brains.
No, but we have a pretty extensive nervous system.
I guess, yeah.
So it's
just a different development of the brain, then you're saying?
It definitely is different, because, I mean, technically, octopus is kind of a pretty low on the complexity scale when it comes to life forms. So it probably, again, this is just quick Google research, but I suspect it says they have a nervous system which contains a central brain. So probably do have like a central, I don't know, cluster of neurons that access the brain. And as life gets more complex or kind of moves up the complexity level, so fish have a centralized brain, and obviously all mammals have a centralized brain as well.
So one of them would be centralized, is what you're saying? Like in the octopus? One of the brains?
I have no idea.
Okay.
So
who knows? Anyone who knows anything about octopi.
So we need an octopus expert, or I need to do some more research on octopus. But
I'm asking too many questions about the octopus.
Nonetheless, they're very fascinating creatures, and they're pretty smart for such a small creature.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think looking at like split personalities and things like that, like I wonder if that person who went shopping and like couldn't grab things from the shelves because their other hand was swatting it away, I wonder if they did get better after time. I wonder if like we can heal ourselves in that way.
So the reason why I think there is generally kind of this one consciousness, I mean, splitting up the brain essentially prevents the communications between the two hemispheres. So that's why I feel like the swatting away is kind of just a symptom of essentially the damage in the brain. That this inability to kind of coordinate the signals between the two halves is what's causing the symptom of this swatting. So I would imagine, based on, again, kind of just some preliminary reading, the brain appears to be able to kind of over time be able to eventually remove this, split brain kind of activity. So I would assume that there needs to be some kind of rewiring in the brain in order for that to actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really skeptical when hearing about the two halves of the brain having their own separate consciousness. I just don't think that's possible. I think that we would have a full consciousness, and then definitely some of the missed connections in the wiring would be what's causing those symptoms. And hearing about how our brains can kind of adapt and reform new neural pathways, it kind of makes sense that it's just that one consciousness. And it's just fixing itself.
Comes to the question of what is consciousness exactly. Like, it's hard. I find it hard to describe exactly what consciousness is. So
I think it's the stuff that's outside of your physical movements. So like she talked about the physical movements being this indicator of the two consciousnesses, but I think that consciousness has to do with things like memory and emotion and that sort of thing versus these physical movements that they're testing.
But isn't it all just essentially like pre-programmed things in our minds? I mean, this is all like a production of, or a product of, our evolution. We're just programmed to have these feelings because we needed them to survive. And I mean, to me, this brings back to a conversation we had on like artificial intelligence in terms of like, can you mimic a lot of these things through just coding? I think you can. I think you can mimic everything we do in our brains.
That's kind of like the nature versus nurture debates. You're falling on the nurture, that you can learn these emotions, and then so this robot can learn the emotions and then portray them?
I wouldn't say that, because some of our ability to either react to the world or potentially maybe some of our capabilities are tied to nature. I mean, just through our DNA, but our brains are, I think, malleable enough to be able to pick up certain capabilities and skills just through learning through our environment over time. But my point with like talking about AI is just our ability to have feelings and to take in new information and learn new skills. I mean, this is all just an outcome of our evolution, because again, we needed this to survive. So we have this ability that's been developed over millions of years through evolution. And to me, I mean, artificial intelligence, in theory, we should be able to program that type of capability as well in the future. But so I don't know what's really that. I don't really know what's that special about consciousness. To me, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, that's fair. Do you think that maybe there are other beings out in the universe that have similar consciousnesses who've developed quite as much as us?
I think it goes back to, at the end of the day, whether their evolution made it possible or it made sense for their evolution to have.
So you need those environmental factors.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. If we kind of use life on Earth as a template, making the assumption that life will follow similar trajectories as the Earth, I don't know if that's true, but the trajectory of life on Earth started from very simple and got more and more complex over time. And it appears like the more complex creatures have some ability to be able to recognize the world, what's going on in the world, and react to it. So to me, that's some form of consciousness, being able to understand what is happening to their environment, to themselves. And I would imagine if there were life elsewhere, that potentially it would need this awareness in order for its own survival as well. So I can envision other life forms having consciousness as well.
Maybe one day we'll find them. Maybe not, though. I doubt it. Not in my lifetime.
I doubt it too. There's just too much distance between us and a potential nearby planet that could harbor intelligent life.
How do we feel about the brain now?
Well, the brain is awesome.
Yay, brain! Pinky and the brain,
Okay.
brain.
Oh. Going back to Love, Death, and Robots, one of the episodes has Brain, the guy that
The brain?
voices the brain
No.
in it. And he's narrating an awesome episode.
I'm gonna have to watch this.
Yeah, the episode is, I think it's called When the Yogurt Took Over or something like that. But I'll set up the premise. Basically, humans accidentally created sentient yogurt.
I mean, we love yogurt.
And that's what I will say about that episode. Basically, they accidentally created a sentient yogurt.
Do people eat the yogurt?
Oh no, because it's sentient.
Okay.
It's something that's intelligent. So, but it eventually takes over the world.
Oh, okay.
So
that's interesting.
yeah, it's a really, really creative piece of animation. I do have to warn though, this is definitely not for kids because it is very rated R. There's
the rated R yogurt.
the yogurt episodes is pretty safe. There's actually no, it's not. No, don't show it to kids. No, definitely don't show it to kids. There's a lot of adult themes in it, and yeah, so it's definitely not for kids. It's made for grown-ups, and it's and each episode is very, very different and different styles. Some of it is quite violent, some isn't. So it's a whole mix, but yeah, overall very good.
So with this sentient yogurt, do you think that humans could potentially make sentient beings just by applying the right environmental pressures? Like, do you think we could ever figure that out?
I think we probably could if we had enough time. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all, I mean, you kind of look at dogs, for example. I mean, dogs essentially originate from wolves, right? So that evolutionary period between wolves and dogs are, I don't know, a few thousand years, something like that. But when you look at dogs, I mean, their brain capacity, I don't think has really expanded that much. In fact, it probably got worse because they're highly dependent on humans now. So, yeah, I mean, if you had the right environmental pressures, you can probably start influencing that. But I think it's also a matter of time. I mean, when you're talking about like human evolution, I mean, we're talking about millions of years between, primates to humans. And we we don't have that much time.
What else is there to say about brains? I have brain knowledge, but it has nothing to do with splitting the brain or left brain, right brain.
It is a myth that I'm sure you might have heard this, some people are right brain dominant or left brain dominant, like meaning, one person's more creative if they're, I forgot what side of the brain's more creative ones. In quotations, I'm saying creative one.
I did read up on that, and I read how it's not true because we've got multiple areas of the brain that are communicating. So you might have some mathematic processes on the left side and different ones on the right side, and you have to access them in order to, solve a mathematical problem.
Yeah. So it's not true that we're dominant on one side of the brain or the other. Our brains need to communicate with each other. And the other one that's also a myth is, I don't know if you heard some memes out there talking about how humans only use 10% of our brains or something like that. I've heard that.
I don't think
definitely
that's true.
Not true at all. It doesn't make any sense at all. The reason why we have our brains and the size of brains we have is we do need this much capacity in order to be able to do what we do, in order to speak and visualize and to hear. We definitely use all of our brain. It's not like there's hidden capacity that we're just untapped.
Yeah, and I think the only reasonable way you could look at that would be to say, oh, we only used 10% at a time. But even then, that's not true because we've got so many senses that are happening. We've got visual, we've got language processes, we've got touch, all of our senses. Yeah.
Exactly, and we don't normally pay attention to it, right? Currently, every nerve on my body is sensing the environment, but I'm not thinking about every single thing I'm touching right now or hearing or seeing. I'm selective as to what I'm paying attention to. That's definitely a myth.
Yeah.
I know there's even been a lot of movies made around it about how, I don't know, some special drug allows you to tap 100% of your brain or something like that. But no.
Yeah,
not true.
I think a lot of it is popular culture wanting to understand human functions and human personalities and that sort of thing where they can't tap into the science quite as much. Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for listening to Kenny and I talk about the brain with our limited sets of knowledge. Hopefully we've been interesting enough. Next month, we are going to be hearing a lecture from Rory Davis. He's going to talk to us about basic income, which is something that is highly publicized in the news right now because the Liberal government gave basic income as a trial to a certain set of people, and then the Conservative government took it away. So it will be interesting to hear what Rory has to say about basic income. So we're really excited to hear from him. And then we will be recording a podcast where it will be Kenny and I and Rory, and if anyone else joins us, and we'll talk about some of the topics that he talked about and hopefully get more insight from him on basic income.
So thanks everyone for listening to our highly disjointed podcast. Our brain capacity is very limited for this podcast, but we gave it a shot.
It's the best we can say.
Thanks everyone. We will see you next time.
Look out for those superhuman squids. I'm only using 10% of my brain right now. Yeah. Have we recorded enough time, do you think? We have gone on a crazy tangent. We have nothing else to say about the brain. Our brains have died.
Well, what happens if someone has split personality on Mars?
Too bad our Mars expert's not here to talk about development in Mars.
What if one half of the brain doesn't want to be on Mars and the other one wants to be on Mars?